I mean, most people do love Sesame Street, but they often don't know sort of the depth of our work or the impact and the sort of the proven outcomes. And, that's something we are so proud of, and it's so rewarding. And again, I think the need for our work is as great as it was 55 years ago.
If not greater.
If not greater.
Yeah. What do Elmo and Cookie Monster have to do with global humanitarian crises? Just ask Sherrie Westin. As president and interim CEO of Sesame Workshop, the educational nonprofit behind Sesame Street, Westin leads the effort to bring Sesame Street's educational programming to children around the world who need it most. Westin has spearheaded the effort to bring the iconic children's show to more than 150 countries, with a particular focus on reaching children affected by crisis in places like Bangladesh and East Africa, and kids who've been forcibly displaced in Ukraine and Afghanistan. In 2017, the MacArthur Foundation granted Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee a $100 million grant to bring early education to Syrian refugees, the largest ever intervention in early childhood education in the history of humanitarian response. I've got a toddler, so I watch a whole lot of Sesame Street from the safety of my living room. But this conversation with Westin taught me that this classic kids show is about more than just counting and sharing. We spoke to Westin back in March, and she explained how Sesame Street can improve mental health, increase gender equity, and expand educational opportunities for children around the world. I'm Charlotte Alter, senior correspondent for Time, and this is Person of the Week. So most people obviously know Sesame Street, which is probably the TV show that I watch the most right now because I have a 2-year-old daughter and she's obsessed with it.
Yes, music to my ears.
But not everybody's familiar with Sesame Workshop, which is the organization behind the show. Can you start off by explaining to our listeners what is Sesame Workshop and how does it relate to Sesame Street and the work that Sesame Workshop does?
Well, Sesame Workshop is the nonprofit organization that produces Sesame Street here and around the world. When Joan Gance Cooney, the creator of Sesame Street, launched Sesame Street in 1969, she created the Children's Television Workshop, and that was the organization that produced Sesame Street. About 20 years ago or more, we changed the name from Children's Television Workshop to Sesame Workshop, just so that people would really associate it with Sesame Street, and we were so much more than television. So it's the same organization, and again, I think we're best known, of course, for Sesame Street, but often people think of it as this iconic domestic, U.S. television show, and don't really know the depth and breadth of our work.
Right.
Because today we reach children in over 150 countries.
Wow.
But I think what's most interesting is that in many of those countries, it's local adaptations of Sesame Street. So if you're German and you grew up watching Sesame Street, you think Bert and Ernie are German. It's not the U.S. show dubbed or seen in other countries. And one of my favorite anecdotes from Joan is she said when she created Sesame Street that she just thought she was creating the quintessential American show. And Germany, Mexico, and Brazil all reached out saying they wanted their own productions. And that's what led to what we called our local co-productions, these adaptations. And then if you fast forward to sort of the late 80s, 90s, we started receiving funding from USAID to help create local productions in more developing countries like South Africa, Egypt, Bangladesh. And so if you were to be in Bangladesh and see Sisimpur, you would recognize it as Sesame Street, but there would also be local Muppets that were designed with local advisors and educators, but creating characters and storylines that children can relate to that are specifically designed to address a specific curriculum, their needs, their language, and their culture.
It's so interesting because the Sesame Street that I watch here in the United States, and I live in New York, part of the reason that my daughter loves it is that it feels like a New York show. They sit on a stoop. There's lots of public transit that seems familiar to her. There's a community that feels like a New York block. So I'm curious, how do you adapt this community that, like, in its sort of original form is very New York-centric. Does the Brazil show or the Germany show, do they have different sets?
Yes. Brazil, Via Sesamo. As I said, Germany, Sesame Straße. In Mexico, Plaza Sesamo. In Afghanistan, we're no longer on the air there, but it was Bache Simpson, which was Sesame Garden. So it's always designed by those local advisors and educators, producers. What we're doing is we're exporting a model, but making sure that it's truly local in its inception, its creation. And we believe children learn best when they see themselves reflected and when they can identify with those programs, those settings, those storylines. So yes, if you were watching Ahlan Simpson in the Middle East, it's filmed on a set in Jordan. And when we created Gully Gully Simpson, that's an alley in India, the set would reflect the geography, the place, but also the culture.
So what stays the same?
What would stay the same would be the fact that our mission is to help children grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. So while there might be a particular curricular focus, perhaps emotional well-being or gender equity, there would always be the academics, the foundational learning in Smarter, the resilience, health in terms of stronger, and kinder. There would always be empathy and understanding, respect for differences. So those core values and goals would be infused in any production. So again, there'll be certain emphasis because of a particular issue we're trying to address, but the fundamental values and the fundamental goals, what children need in terms of their healthy development in those critical early years, is universal.
Right. When Sesame Street premiered on PBS in 1969, it became one of the most popular children's shows on television, and it's the longest-running children's series. But nowadays, it's competing with, I mean, there's Paw Patrol, there's Bluey, there's Cocomelon, there's a million different things that kids are watching. How has Sesame Street adapted to that? How does it stay kind of competitive in an environment where kids and parents are so inundated with things that they can watch?
Well, I think it all goes back to sort of the prescience of Joan and her colleagues. Not only did they focus on preschool, which we know today from all of the neuroscience are the most important years for a child in terms of their learning, their brain development. She also had a hunch that the learning would be deeper if an adult were watching with a child. And that's what led to bringing in Jim Henson, the Muppets, having parodies, humor, celebrities, musicians. Okay, fast forward, and the research shows the most important thing for a child to learn is that engagement with a caring adult. It also happens to be critical, even more so if a child has experienced adversity or trauma. But also having those celebrities and musicians and parodies that are culturally relevant has really been a huge asset in helping us remain culturally relevant. If you think about it, I've had so many celebrities say that they knew they had arrived when they were invited to be on Sesame Street. You know, so it keeps us sort of in tune with the times.
It's like SNL for toddlers.
Exactly. I mean, literally. But I also believe it's because we are constantly focused on what are the most pressing needs affecting children. It's the reason Sesame Street was started. You know, it was the late 60s. It was the war on poverty. It was the civil rights movement, and there was so much research that showed that children in poverty, often most children of color, were showing up without the same skills to be able to learn in kindergarten. And so the reason Joan came up with the whole experiment with Lloyd Morissette, the co-founder, was could you use television to reach children who didn't have the same advantages to give them the skills to arrive at school ready to learn? If you fast forward 55 years, a global pandemic, more children displaced than any other time. The fact that her mission and her vision is as needed and relevant today, the ability to use media, not just television anymore, but all sorts of digital media, to provide access to children who may not have that access, is, to me, just what makes this work so incredibly valuable and rewarding.
Did you always have an interest in childhood education?
Well, it's funny because when I look back, I did always love doing things with children. I was the oldest. I had 2 little brothers. I grew up with a young mother who loved being a mom. And we had a kind of childhood that you take for granted and later realize how fortunate you were. There was just a lot of neighborhood best friends, kickball, dodgeball. I remember, you got a new refrigerator, so you took the box and you made it into a puppet theater, and Mom helped make the marionettes, and we would have shows. Or I think I created something called Creative Class in 4th grade, and all the younger neighborhood kids would come to our house. It was like a little mini daycare or camp that I did for years. I thought that I would be a teacher. If you asked me in 4th grade what I wanted to be, it would be a teacher. And when I went to University of Virginia, I thought about majoring in special ed. I ended up not doing that, but I didn't have an idea. I wasn't sure. I changed my path and my direction, and it was more that I was just open to a lot of different things. I used to do like career day speeches later at UVA, and so I would often tell students, you can also not know exactly what you're going to do as long as you're really open. You try things. Learning that you really don't like something is as important as learning what you do.
Right. So you didn't start off in children's television at all. You were working in PR. You were working in politics. You were at ABC News for a while.
Well, I ended up, yes, in the Bush administration. I was at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I was Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs. And it just happened. Normally, no one pays any attention to HUD, but it was a time when there was a lot of news. And that led to an offer, because I worked so closely with the media, to come to ABC News. And when I did come to Sesame Street, it was largely because I was a relatively new mom.
Yeah.
I adopted my daughter when she was 5 months old from China. It was just the most important thing I had ever done. It was my defining moment. I was still at ABC, which I loved. But I will be honest, when Disney bought ABC, one of the ideas was to create a children's channel. It was going to be ABZ. And I was so excited because I was a new mom. The thought of really focusing on children's versus news, sports, data, everything else. And then Disney decided not to. They pulled the plug. But that is really, honestly, the first time I've deliberately sought a particular job or career. Having a daughter, having always cared a great deal about kids and children, just really helped me suddenly focus on being in media, having media experience, children's media, and the importance of quality children's media. And again, that's the first time I literally started thinking, okay, I'd like to work in children's television. And Joan Gantz-Cooney said, would you ever consider coming to Sesame Street? And I've been there ever since.
And so tell me about this moment of early motherhood for you. Were you watching Sesame Street with your daughter? Was she watching it?
Yeah.
How did you first encounter Sesame Street and first begin to take it seriously as a sort of cultural phenomenon?
I remember bringing Lily home, and she must only be like 7 or 8 months old. She sort of plopped on the dog bed in front of the TV, and I had put in Big Bird Goes to China. Lily spent the first 5 months of her life in China, and she was just mesmerized. And I'm sure it was partly the sights, the sounds. So that's when I started paying attention to Sesame Street, And when she was 3, that's when I ended up being fortunate enough to come to work at Sesame. I remember because she was 3.5, and she was always very precocious. I always thought she was an old soul, so wise beyond her years. But I called her as I was coming home. My first day, she knew I was going to work at Sesame Street.
Wow.
And I called to say, I'm on my way home. And she said, were they nice to you?
Oh, my God.
And I thought, yeah, they're really nice. And she goes, which one was the nicest? And I realized she was talking about the Muppets. It was so cute. Were they nice to you? I mean, she thought Elmo was in the office next door,
she thought
and
Elmo
Cookie
was like
down
your
the hall.
boss.
Yeah, so cute.
Oh, my God. Well, what did you say?
I said, yes, they really were.
Oh, my God. That's so cute. Yeah. My daughter, she loves Elmo. She loves Abby, who's relatively new. But one of the things that has always struck me about Sesame Street is how they are able to create these really compelling narratives with stakes and emotional reality to them that don't have a villain, where everybody is relatively well-intentioned and people make mistakes, but then they correct them, and people have conflicts, but then they resolve them.
Well, listen, I have to say, we take it so seriously. And so every script, there's such purpose.
Yeah.
And then there's research, there's child development experts, because everything is steeped in sort of education, research. And I love that you say there's never a villain. We have tackled a lot of issues that people might think are adult issues, but we're looking at them through the lens of a child.
Yeah.
Parental incarceration, parental addiction, mental health crisis. How do those issues affect young children? And when we do so, it's in a way that is also joyful, hopeful, but often really helping those caregivers or parents have the resources they need to address some of those tough issues.
Right.
And that's such a part of our history, too. If you go back to when Mr. Hooper died, who was one of the original cast members, Hooper's Store, they didn't just recast him. They spent all of this time thinking about how do we do this and created a special episode where Maria explains to Big Bird that Mr. Hooper's not coming back because he died. So even helping young children understand loss and grieving and even death.
More with Sesame Workshop's Sherrie Westin in a minute. So you mentioned that there's a lot of research that goes into sort of figuring out developmentally appropriate ways to talk about some of these things. Can you tell me a little bit about that research process?
Well, if we were going into a new country with a new initiative like we did with Ahlan Simpson, which means Welcome Sesame, it's a production where we created local Arabic content. It was designed to address the Syrian crisis in the sense that there were so many displaced children from Syria, but also displacement within Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq. And we started with a partnership with the International Rescue Committee early on just to say, wait, we have so much experience in the region with productions in Jordan and Egypt over the years. Is there any way we could leverage or use our content in a way that might help? And I went to David Miliband at the time and said, would you consider doing a pilot? If we can fund it, we could do something in Jordan. I never imagined at the time that we would also, a few months later, hear about something called the MacArthur 100 and Change. And it was the MacArthur Foundation's first ever $100 million grant. They created a competition. And I said, well, we should apply for this, never dreaming that we would be selected. I mean, 1,900 and some applicants 18 months later. But we were selected, which was such a gift to say, okay, boy, we can look at something for 5 years with the funding to have a longer-term program and really think about that model. It allowed us to create literally the largest early childhood intervention in humanitarian response. So think of it as we're creating all new Arabic content with local Muppets children can relate to. But by starting with the needs assessment, bringing in local talent and educators, we design it based on what's the curricular goal. It was clear we needed to focus on emotional well-being, the emotional ABCs, if you will, because of what children had experienced in the region. And that led to the concept of 2 new Muppets, 3 actually. There's an adorable little goat named Mezuzah. But the storylines, one is Jod. He left his home. He becomes best friends with Basma, who welcomes him with open arms. So we're not going to say Jod is the refugee Muppet, but we're going to have storylines and characteristics that children can identify with and relate to that allow us to model so many things that are really important in that production. Combine that with IRC, home visits, learning centers, health clinics, where we have now this incredible popular program where we can reach millions of children. We're reaching 27 million through digital, satellite, YouTube, and creating print materials and content on WhatsApp to reach children and families directly, particularly for the more vulnerable, where you've got an IRC staff doing home visits or facilitating. And so that is an incredible model. We also invested a huge amount in research so that we could test the outcomes. Are we achieving the goals we set out to? And in success, you share this with the world because it has become a foundation that led to our work in Bangladesh and the Rohingya crisis, today in Latin America and Colombia and Ukraine. We've learned so much about what children need and about how we can reach them when education is disrupted.
So one question I have is, often when children are refugees, if they're experiencing the kind of crisis where they would really benefit from this kind of content, what if they don't have a TV? What if they don't have regular internet access? How do you get this content to kids who might not have a home where there's a electrical outlet?
I think that's the power of having the experience in different contexts. For instance, in the Middle East, a great example that speaks to different ways of reaching, but also the research impact, is during COVID, we obviously could not do any of the direct service programs like the learning centers, being in school, home visits. So we took the content and put it on WhatsApp. Okay, there is access to cell phones. That is dominant throughout the region. And so what we did was we had IRC-trained staff call groups of parents who had a Hunt Simpson on their mobile phone on WhatsApp twice a week to facilitate the engagement of here's how we're going to use this content with your children. NYU Global Ties, who was a research partner, did a randomized control trial on that program and found that the children who were in the remote learning with the WhatsApp content had learning outcomes in 11 weeks, it's 2 calls a week, that were equivalent to a full year of pre-K.
Wow.
Now, I will say, I love to say that speaks to the power of Sesame, but it's more than that. It's that they were facilitating that increased engagement between the adult and child with the resources. And one of the places I think Sesame has the most impact is because people think of it as just television. No, A, it's all forms of media, high-tech, low-tech. But B, often we're creating content that is literally a catalyst for engagement between adult and child. And when we then, because of the Lego Foundation, were able to go into the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, it was eye-opening because they had no access to media. This is not like the Middle East. They're all in one camp rather than the majority of children being in host communities. And we had to do very low-tech. It was battery-operated Pico projectors in play labs that our partners BRAC hosted. Fast forward to Colombia and our work in Latin America, they're not in host communities or in one camp. They're on the move. It's migrant. So that's where something like WhatsApp becomes a very powerful tool.
Yeah.
So as I said, what children need is the same. The context of how you might be able to reach them and provide resources to their parents and caregivers or teachers can be very different. And then I would say on particular issues, it's not just about letters and numbers. It's about modeling behaviors and sort of planting the seeds for societal change. Afghanistan is a great example. We're not there now for obvious reasons, but we were there for over 10 years, and girls' education was a priority. And we had research on the number of children we were reaching, the number of girls, but also on attitudes of gender equity. We would test boys' attitudes who watched Bache Simpson. And again, the reach was tremendous. And they tested 29% higher on attitudes of gender equity, saying it was fine for girls to go to school. We even had focus groups that were qualitative, not quantitative, but showed time and time again that fathers would cite watching Bache Simpson as the reason they changed their mind about permitting their daughter to go to school.
Adult men.
Yes, and I would say that's
really
the power of media and Muppets to sort of open hearts and minds.
So you have also led the initiative that has led to some of the creation of some new Sesame Street characters, like I'm thinking of Kami, the world's first HIV-positive Muppet, and Julia, a Muppet with autism. How do you think about new characters that should be created to speak to some specific situations that kids are in?
Well, Kami, that was an example where we had launched in South Africa with Takalani Sesame, funded by USAID, and about a year or two in, the Minister of Education, a man named Kader Asmal, who's no longer with us, but said if we weren't addressing HIV and AIDS, we were doing a huge disservice. And we were like, oh my gosh, how can we do that? It's for 3-year-olds.
Yeah.
But we took it very seriously and decided we could do this, and we created the first ever preschool HIV and AIDS curriculum. Now, it was completely age-appropriate. It was lessons like you can't catch HIV and AIDS from playing with someone who's HIV positive. It led to the creation of Cami, a Muppet whose part of her identity was HIV positive. I mean, her storyline was her mother had died of AIDS, so you have opportunities to have coping. It was never something that a preschooler shouldn't know.
Yeah.
But I am absolutely convinced we have saved lives because it broke down the stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS. It made it okay to talk about. And there are so many, AIDS workers and teachers and others in South Africa who've told me over the years that it changed everything. It made it okay to talk about. You can't teach prevention if it's taboo to talk about. And so I think, from an adult standpoint too, of making it okay for mothers to get treatment, it's just a powerful story. And Julia, fast forward, was part of our autism initiative called See Amazing in All Children to also break down the stigma surrounding autism because there was such a growing number of children who were diagnosed with autism. And one of the things I'm most proud of with the introduction of Julia is there is no question that Julia is groundbreaking. She helps children with autism feel less alone, see themselves. But I think it's as important, and we have so much research to show it, that Julia has helped neurotypical children understand autism, to be more empathetic, to look for commonalities and not just differences.
Right.
Like when Big Bird says to Abby, just because Julia doesn't look in your eye doesn't mean she doesn't want to be your friend. She has autism. Like, it makes it okay to talk about and explain.
So I'm curious, if you look at the issues affecting kids right now, what are the kinds of conversations that Sesame Workshop is thinking about facilitating, given what a child in 2024 is experiencing?
Well, the reason we have a priority initiative around emotional well-being was because we knew there was a mental health crisis. The pandemic has only exacerbated that. The American Academy of Pediatrics has cited that there is a mental health crisis for young children. And so that's led to our emotional well-being work. And we are really committed to that. You may have noticed that there was a tweet that became incredibly viral.
I was going to ask you about that.
When Elmo asked how people were doing, right? And while I don't think we ever expected the incredible response in terms of, I think over 300 million people end up seeing that exchange. But what I love about it is it was tied to our emotional well-being work. And we leveraged that by providing the resources for parents, for caregivers, for their children's emotional well-being in all of that followed with that. So it was so true to our priorities, our mission, and we were able, I think, to really, again, drive awareness of those resources and help people understand that it's an issue that you can look at also from the lens of a child.
So what do you think is next for Sesame Workshop? Besides emotional well-being, what are some of the things you see on the horizon that you think are big problems that Sesame Workshop's work can help address?
Well, it's not only focused on problems. We'll always be focused on the opportunities to give children what they need to thrive. But the work that we started with Ahlan Simpson has led to a body of work we call Welcome Sesame. There are over 110 million people displaced today. And sadly, that number's not going down. So we're really committed to expanding that work and making sure that we're creating content that is more easily adapted to other cultures, other languages. We can't always afford to do an entire local production.
Right.
That's a priority. Secondly, I would say that when you think of climate, and certainly looking at it through climate displacement, this is a real issue that children are going to be faced with, and the next generation will be the most impacted for their entire lives. So we are looking very seriously at where can we provide climate content for young children. Yes, being able to reach them when they're displaced and some of the most marginalized places where children are going to unfortunately be impacted the most, but this is going to affect all children. We're seeing that more and more. It's not just in the developing world. Look at the extreme weather and climate-related instances here in the U.S.
Right, of course.
And so if you look at through the sort of our impact areas of what a child needs in terms of like curricular goals, it's self and belonging, it's problem solving, it's the foundational skills, it's resilience. Now look at that through the lens of climate. STEM, science, environmental literacy. In terms of belonging, when children are forming their sense of self, it's about thinking of yourself as an environmental steward, if you will. At a very young age, you start to develop these skills and possibilities and opportunities. In terms of creative problem solving, children will need the agency, right, to address these issues. And lastly was resilience. And there's a real issue in terms of climate resilience. So we are looking not only at how we can help fill the voids in climate displacement by being there and reaching children with educational resources, but also how can we start to infuse some of the actual curriculum into the content that can be helpful for children as they're addressing climate issues going forward.
You know, I always have stuck in my head because my daughter is a huge Elmo fan. I wonder what if let's try as just a phrase because she started to say it. And I guess I didn't realize until I thought about it more how wise that phrase is for teaching children about sort of curiosity. I wonder what happens if we do this. What if we try that? Let's try it. Like in one phrase, it's sort of curiosity, it's creativity, it's engagement.
They'll often mimic Sesame. I wonder, point to their head.
She does that.
What if, let's try. I love that. It's sort of like when Sesame first started, people would realize that their children were reciting the ABCs or the 1, 2, 3s from watching Sesame Street. And it was such demonstrable skills. It's why people so often think of Sesame as the 1, 2, 3s and ABCs. What I love about I wonder, what if, let's try, is I hear from so many parents today that they stop and think, wow, my child is saying that from watching Sesame Street. It's another demonstrable, outcome, and yet it shows that it's so much deeper than just ABC. As President Obama said, there are a lot of lessons that parents and adults could stand to learn from Sesame Street. I always love that.
Sherrie, it's been so great talking to you about your extensive career in media and politics and your incredible groundbreaking work with Sesame Workshop. But now we want to learn a little bit more about some of the things that make up your everyday life in a segment that we like to call The Last Time. So, when's the last time you went bird watching?
Ooh. April.
Last
Seriously,
April.
last
Wow.
April. Serious bird watching.
Did you see any interesting birds?
I did, but I would have to have my Merlin app to tell you the names.
Okay. Okay. When's the last time you spoke to your kids?
Does text count?
Yes, it totally
this
counts.
This morning.
Okay. When's the last time you got Elmo's laugh stuck in your head?
Last week when I showed an adorable video of Elmo laughing for an ad council spot on emotional well-being.
Okay. When's the last time you watched Sesame Street yourself?
Well, because I watch clips a lot, it would be today.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. When is the last time you spoke to Joan Gans Cooney?
Last week.
Okay.
Always a huge treat.
And when's the last time you made a meal for yourself? And what did you make?
Well, making a meal for myself, it would be over the past weekend, but it would be along the lines of like tuna fish sandwich.
And then, of course, if this was one of the cooking segments on Sesame Street, they'd be like, we're making a tuna fish sandwich. We have bread. We have mayonnaise. Where's the tuna? And then they go
and we'd talk about what colors we had. We would add some green, some lettuce, some red, some tomato.
Exactly. Well, Sherrie, thank you so much for coming on. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you again.
To learn more about all the ways Sherrie Westin is expanding Sesame Street around the world, visit sesameworkshop.org. Thank you so much for listening to Person of the Week. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd love to hear from you. So send your tips or thoughts on our show to personoftheweek@time.com. I'm Charlotte Alter. See you next week.
Person of the Week is hosted by Charlotte Alter. It's produced by Nina Bisbano and Allison Bailey. Our senior producer is Ursula Summer. Our story editor is Katie Feather. This episode was mixed by Joe Plourde. Our theme music was composed by Billy Libby. Joseph Frischmuth is our fact-checker. Person of the Week is a co-production of Time Studios and Sugar 23. At Time, our executive producers are Dave O'Connor, Michael Erlinger, and Sam Jacobs. At Sugar 23, our executive producers are Mike Mayer, Michael Sugar, and Liam Billingham. Sasha Matthias is the head of audio at Time. You can find us online at time.com/personoftheweek and wherever you get your podcasts.